Welcome to Young's Multimedia Presents International Narratives, a podcast that explores the rise, evolution, and impact of nations across history. From ancient empires to modern states, each episode unpacks how geography, politics, conflict, and culture have shaped the world's most influential countries. Please note, this podcast is intended for educational and entertainment purposes. While we strive for accuracy, the host is not a professional historian. Listeners are encouraged to share corrections or insights. Now, join us as we uncover the story behind today's featured nation.
Before there was a country, there was a coast. Before there was independence, there was desperation. And before the American dream, there was a nightmare of survival. Welcome to International Narratives. I'm Johnny Young, and this is Season 1, Episode 1, The Colonial and Revolutionary Period, 1607 to 1789. This story doesn't begin with freedom. It begins with failure, ambition, and a fight to stay alive. Let's go back to a world on the edge of an empire, where the idea of America was nothing more than a rumor, and the wilderness was a battleground between greed, God, and sheer will. The year is 1607. 3 English ships, the Susan Constant, the Godspeed, and the Discovery, drift slowly up the James River. On board, 104 men and boys, funded by the Virginia Company, driven by dreams of gold, land, and glory. They named their settlement Jamestown, but glory would have to wait. The land was marshy, the water was brackish, the air carried disease. Within 9 months, more than half of the settlers were dead. Yet still, they stayed. Captain John Smith was no aristocrat. He was a scrappy adventurer who took charge when others faltered. He enforced discipline, bartered with native, and kept the colony from collapse. In his own writings, Smith claimed that while he was captured by the Powhatan tribe, a young girl named Pocahontas threw herself across his body, saving his life. Today, historians debate that version of the story. Was it rescue? A ritual? A myth? But one thing is clear. Pocahontas became the face of a new world, a bridge between 2 civilizations, romanticized for centuries. Born around 1596, Pocahontas was a daughter of Chief Powhatan, one of the most powerful leaders in the region. Her real name was Aminute. Pocahontas was a nickname, meaning playful one. She was barely a teenager when the English arrived. Years later, she was kidnapped by the English, baptized as Rebecca, and married settler John Rolfe. She traveled to England, where she died of illness in 1617 at just 21 years old. To the English, she was a symbol of peace. To her people, she was a daughter lost to history. After Smith returned to England, the colony spiraled. In the winter of 1609 to 1610, the starving time, colonists resorted to eating horses, dogs, even each other. Out of 500 settlers, only 60 survived. Yet, still, they stayed. Why? Why endure such horror? Because this wasn't just a voyage. It was a business. English population was exploding, its economy was teetering, and across the ocean lay land for farming, wealth, and empire. Colonization became a strategy for power, and that strategy would reshape the world. In 1619, a ship carrying 20 and odd Negroes arrived in Virginia. They were enslaved Africans brought to work the tobacco fields. Their arrival marked the beginning of slavery in English North America, not as an afterthought, but as a foundation. Soon, Jamestown was just one of many. The Plymouth Colony in 1620, pilgrims seeking religious freedom. Massachusetts Bay, a Puritan theocracy built on discipline and divine mission. Maryland, a Catholic haven founded by Lord Baltimore. And Rhode Island, a refuge for the religiously persecuted. Each colony was unique, but all were defined by tension. Tensions with the land, with the indigenous nations, and with each other. In Pennsylvania, William Penn, a Quaker and son of an admiral, envisioned a holy experiment. He signed treaties with native tribes, encouraged religious tolerance, and welcomed settlers from across Europe. For a time, Pennsylvania thrived as a diverse, peaceful colony. But even Penn's ideals couldn't stop the tide of expansion. To the Powhatan tribe, Wampanoag, and the Iroquois, these newcomers were not pilgrims, they were invaders. In 1622, the Powhatan launched a massive uprising, killing over 300 colonists. The English responded with years of retaliatory warfare. This would become the pattern: treaty, betrayal, war, expansion. By the 1700s, the Atlantic coast was lined with colonies, some rural, some urban, all uneasy. The seeds of an American identity were quietly sprouting. But empire is a hungry thing, and soon the British Crown would demand more from its colonies than just obedience. By the mid-1700s, the 13 colonies had grown into thriving, diverse, and restless communities. From the shipyards of Boston to the rice fields of Georgia, a new spirit stirred, one shaped by hard labor, deep faith, and growing defiance. These weren't simply subjects of a king anymore, they were farmers, merchants, printers, and blacksmiths, carving lives in a new world and beginning to imagine a future free from the old one. The 70 Years' War, known in the colonies as the French and Indian War, ended in 1763 with a British victory. But that victory came with a staggering bill. Defending the colonies had drained the crown's coffers. To Parliament, the answer was obvious: make the colonies pay. They introduced a series of laws, small taxes, new customs, stricter regulations. To Parliament, these were reasonable. To the colonists, they were a declaration of ownership. After the war, King George III issued the Proclamation of 1763, barring colonists from settling west of the Appalachian Mountains. To many colonists, especially war veterans' promised land, this felt like betrayal. The frontier was opportunity, and now the king had locked the door. In 1765, in response to the Stamp Act, Patrick Henry rose in the Virginia House of Burgesses and thundered. Caesar had his Brutus, Charles I his Cromwell, and George III may profit by their example. If this be treason, make the most of it. This wasn't just eloquence, it was revolution in the making. The Stamp Act required colonists to buy official stamps for printed materials. To Parliament, it was a mild tax. To colonists, it was tyranny with a seal. Protests erupted across the colonies. In taverns and on street corners, a radical group emerged, the Sons of Liberty. Led by men like Samuel Adams, they tarred and feathered tax collectors. They stormed warehouses. They printed pamphlets that burned with fury. Under pressure, Britain repealed the Stamp Act, but they added a warning. They could and would legislate for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. The Daughters of Liberty organized boycotts, spun homespun cloth, and brewed Liberty tea. This is how the colonial women joined the resistance with resolve. They didn't protest. They sustained the movement quietly, powerfully. Tensions boiled over on a cold March evening. British soldiers, surrounded by an angry Boston crowd, opened fire. 5 colonists fell. Among them, Crispus Attucks, a man of African and native descent, the first to die in what would become a revolution. Paul Revere's engraving would soon sweep across the colonies, dramatizing the violence and fueling outrage. When Britain passed the Tea Act, making taxed British tea cheaper than smuggled Dutch tea, it was meant as a trap. On December 16, 1773, colonists, disguised as Mohawk Indians, boarded 3 ships in Boston Harbor. They tossed 342 chests of tea into the sea, a symbolic act of defiance, a line crossed. In retaliation, Parliament passed the Coercive Act, known in America as the Intolerable Act. Boston Harbor was closed, Massachusetts self-government was dissolved, and British troops could be housed in private homes. To the colonies, this wasn't just punishment, it was occupation. In Philadelphia, representatives from 12 of the 13 colonies gathered. For the first time, Americans met as Americans, not just Virginians, Bostonians, or Carolinians. Among them, Patrick Henry declared, "I am not a Virginian, but an American." The dream of unity, fragile, improbable, began to flicker. The colonists had petitioned, they had protested, they had waited. But on April 19, 1775, outside Lexington and Concord, the waiting ended. "Stand your ground. Don't fire unless fired upon." A musket cracks. The first shot, still unnamed, echoes across the colonies. 8 Americans die. The British march on, and American Revolution begins. A nation awakens. No one could have predicted what came next. Not King George, not Parliament, not even the Patriots. But the fuse had burned too long. The fire was coming. War is declared, armies are raised, and a bold declaration shakes the world. The colonies had crossed the line. They had not just defied a king, they had declared their independence. And with that declaration came war, a long, brutal, often uncertain war. But war is not only about muskets and maps, it's about hunger, about freezing nights in muddy camps, about belief that what you're fighting for is worth dying for. The American Revolution wasn't just a rebellion, it was a test of endurance, identity, and imaginations. April 19th, 1775, British redcoats marched toward Concord, Massachusetts to seize colonial weapons. They are met on Lexington Green by 77 nervous Minutemen. Someone, no one who knows who, fires, and with that shot, the war begins. The British press forward, but they ambushed on the return march, sniped at from woods and stone walls by farmers, blacksmiths, and young boys with muskets. By the time they reach Boston, nearly 300 soldiers are dead or wounded. It's no longer protest. It's war. Before dawn broke on April 19th, a network of rioters had already warned the countryside. Paul Revere was the most famous, but others like William Dawes and Samuel Prescott also rode out, racing against time and tyranny. Their mission wasn't just to alert militia leaders, it was to signal that the fight for liberty was no longer theoretical. It had arrived. Just weeks later, on June 17, 1775, Colonial militias dug in on Breed's Hill overlooking Boston. The British launched a frontal assault. Twice they were repelled. The third charge succeeded only because the colonists ran out of ammunition, but the cost? Over 1,000 British casualties, compared to 400 Americans. Though technically a loss, Bunker Hill proved the colonists could stand toe-to-toe with the British Army. That same summer, the Continental Congress appointed George Washington as Commander-in-Chief, and the Continental Army is born. Tall, silent, and resolute, Washington took command of a ragtag force with little training, no navy, and barely enough powder to fire a single volley. But they had a conviction and a cause. In Philadelphia, the delegates of the Second Continental Congress debated a bold question. Should they sever ties with the British Crown? Permanently. On July 2nd, they voted yes. On July 4th, they adopted the Declaration of Independence, drafted by Thomas Jefferson. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Powerful words, but also painfully selective. Slavery persisted. Native people were ignored. Women were invisible in text. Still, the words carry weight, not just across the colonies, but across the world. Winter, 1777, Valley Forge, Pennsylvania. Washington's army camps in snow and starvation. Disease is spread. Clothing is scarce. Men wrap rags around their feet. Over 2,000 die. But something remarkable happens. A Prussian officer named Baron von Steuben arrives and drills them relentlessly. By spring, they emerged hardened, disciplined, united. They're no longer a militia. They're an army. October 1777, American forces under Horatio Gates and Benedict Arnold defeat the British at Saratoga, New York. The victory changes everything. France signed an open alliance, then Spain, then the Dutch. It's no longer Britain versus colonies. It's an international war, and America has allies. Let's pause to spotlight one of the most overlooked heroes, James Armistead Lafayette, who was an enslaved man who became a double agent. He infiltrated British headquarters under the guise of a loyalist. He fed British generals misinformation while secretly passing intelligence to the American side. His work was instrumental to the Americans' victory at Yorktown. After the war, he petitioned the Virginia legislature and was granted his freedom. He took the surname Lafayette in honor of the French general who vouched for him. Women didn't just wait at home. Deborah Sampson disguised herself as a man to join the Continental Army. Molly Pitcher took her wounded husband's place at a cannon during battle. And Mercy Otis Warren wrote scathing political plays and histories. Abigail Adams urged her husband to remember the ladies when drafting the new government. Though denied political power, they shaped the revolution's backbone. The British assumed they'd find loyalist support in the South. Instead, they found guerrilla warfare, hit-and-run attacks from swamps, forests, and back roads. Leaders like Francis Marion, the Swamp Fox, kept British forces constantly off balance. In 1781, British General Cornwallis moved his army to Yorktown, Virginia, where he believed he'd be resupplied by sea. But fate had other plans. October 1781, Washington marches south with French General Rochambeau. The French Navy under Admiral de Grasse blocks the Chesapeake Bay. Cornwallis is trapped, surrounded on land and sea. After a final bombardment, he surrenders his entire army. The war is over. 2 years later, Britain formally recognizes Americans' independence. But the cost? Tens of thousands dead, economy shattered, loyalists exiled, native nations betrayed, slavery unresolved. The war is won, but the work of becoming a nation has only just begun. The revolution lit a torch that the world couldn't ignore. But liberty, once claimed, must be defended, defined, and expanded. Victory had come. The war was over. But for the fledgling United States, peace brought a new kind of war, not with muskets, but with meetings, not in battlefields, but in debates. Now 13 colonies had to do something far more difficult than defeating an empire. They had to agree. They had to become a nation. In 1781, the states ratified their first national charter, the Articles of Confederation. But instead of unity, it created fragmentation. There was no president, no national court system, and Congress couldn't raise taxes or regulate trade. Each state had one vote, regardless of size. and all decisions required near unanimity. The result? Chaos. Imagine 13 neighbors on one street, each with their own lawns, currencies, and customs officers. No central rules, no referees, just tension. And then came Shays' Rebellion. 1786, Western Massachusetts. Hundreds of farmers, many of them veterans, rise up against foreclosures, debts, and taxes. Led by Daniel Shays, they seize courthouses and threaten the federal arsenal. The federal government has no troops to send. The rebellion is eventually suppressed by a private militia, but it exposes a terrifying truth. This government can't protect its own people or itself. The revolution had been fought to break free of tyranny. But what if the result was anarchy? The founders now faced a question they didn't want to answer. Had they gone too far in fearing central power? Philadelphia, summer of 1787. 55 delegates from 12 states, Rhode Island boycotts, gathered to fix the Articles. But soon, it's clear, the Articles aren't fixable. The windows are nailed shut, the sessions are secret, and over 4 sweltering months, a new vision takes shape. George Washington presides. James Madison, young, brilliant, relentless, becomes the chief architect, and Benjamin Franklin, now elderly, lends wisdom and humor. They argue fiercely. Big states versus small states, federal power versus state rights, slave states versus free states. Out of conflict comes compromise. The Great Compromise. 2 houses, 1 Congress. Large states wanted representation based on population. Small states wanted equal representation. The solution? 2 chambers. The House of Representatives, based on population, and the Senate, where every state gets 2 votes. Checks and balances are introduced. A president with limited powers, a judiciary to interpret laws, and Congress to create them. It's not perfect, but it's functional, and it's bold. But unity came at a cost. To appease slaveholding states, delegates agreed to the 3/5 compromise, counting enslaved people as 3/5 of a person for representation, not rights. The word slavery appears nowhere in the Constitution, but its shadow is everywhere. Slaveholders are protected. The international slave trade is allowed to continue until 1808. The founders knew they was deferring to a moral reckoning. They kicked the barrel down the road. Most delegates tiptoed around slavery. Not Governor Morris, a Pennsylvania delegate with a wooden leg and a fiery tongue. He called slavery a nefarious institution, the curse of heaven. He argued that allowing it would infect the very soul of the republic. He lost the argument, but not the history. September 17th, 1787. The final draft of the U.S. Constitution is signed. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union. Those 7 words will echo through centuries. But let's be clear. We, the people, didn't include everyone. Not women, not enslaved people, not Native Americans, and not poor white men without property. Still, the framework was laid, and the fight to expand its meaning had begun. In 1789, George Washington becomes the first president of the United States. He's unanimously elected. He doesn't want power, and that's why they trust him. Washington builds a cabinet, set precedents, and refuses to become a king. He steps down after 2 terms, establishing a tradition that lasts over 140 years. Some feared the Constitution gave too much power to the federal government, so a promise was made: add a Bill of Rights. In 1791, 10 amendments are ratified. freedom of speech, religion, and the press, the right to bear arms, protection from unreasonable searches, the right to a fair trial, and protection against cruel and unusual punishment. These weren't just policies, they were shields forged in the memory of tyranny. But again, not everyone was protected by these rights, and that would be the battle of the next 200 years. The Constitution wasn't perfect. It was never meant to be. It was a framework meant to evolve, and every generation would wrestle with its meaning. But for the first time, there was a map. The war for independence had ended. The struggle for identity was just beginning. The revolution forged the idea. The Constitution forged the structure. But what did it all mean? And who was left out of this American experiment? The story we just traveled through, from Jamestown's starving time to the Constitution's final ink, is often told with grandeur, flags waving, trumpets blaring, but history, real history, is quieter and louder. It is layered, conflicting, and alive. The founding of the United States is not a neat tale. It is a paradox. It is the birth of liberty and the betrayal of it, the rise of a republic and the denial of democracy to many. It is a revolution, incomplete by design. The American Revolution didn't stay American for long. Its idea leapt across oceans. In France, liberté, égalité, fraternité became the rallying cry of a new revolution, inspired directly by the colonists' defiance. The storming of the Bastille, the toppling of monarchy, and the eventual reign of terror all had echoes of 1776. In Haiti, enslaved Africans, led by Toussaint Louverture, rose against French colonial rule, inspired by the very idea that all men were created equal. The result? The only successful slave rebellion in modern history, and the birth of the first Black republic in the Western Hemisphere. In Latin America, figures like Simon Bolivar read Jefferson, studied Washington, and launched wars of independence across the continent. America's cry for liberty became a whisper in every oppressed corner of the world. But back home, in the very land that promised freedom, millions remained bound. While Jefferson wrote all men are created equal, he owned over 600 human beings in his lifetime. The Constitution, it protected the rights of slaveholders while leaving enslaved people voiceless. And George Washington freed his slaves only after his death, and yet enslaved men and women shaped the nation. They built its cities, fought in its wars, nurtured its children, and dreamed of a freedom that founders promised but never delivered. The revolution planted the seed, but it would take the blood of a civil war and the courage of generations to make it bloom. Abigail Adams wrote to her husband, "Remember the ladies." He didn't. Women couldn't vote. They couldn't hold office. They had no legal identity apart from their husbands. Yet women stirred the revolution. They ran farms, boycotted British goods, published pamphlets, spied for the cause, and raised the very men who wrote history. The Constitution made no mention of women, but their impact, invisible to the parchment, was visible everywhere else. And then there were the First Nations, the original stewards of this land. For them, the founding of America wasn't a triumph, it was a tragedy. They had welcomed settlers, signed treaties, fought and negotiated and resisted, but with each decade their lands were taken, their people displaced, their rights erased. Some allied with British during the Revolution, hoping to halt American expansion. They lost, and in losing, they paid the heaviest price. Let's pause and give light to a powerful influence. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy, also known as the Iroquois League, a sophisticated political alliance of indigenous nations in the Northeast. Their model of governance, representative, consensus-driven, deeply democratic, inspired by many Enlightenment thinkers and some of the founders themselves. Benjamin Franklin openly admired the structure of the Iroquois Council, yet when America was formed, these models were excluded from the table. The Constitution begins with 3 words, "We the people." But in 1789, the people didn't mean everyone. Still, the words were written. And once written, they could be wielded by abolitionists, by suffragists, by civil rights leaders, by immigrants, activists, and dreamers of every kind. The founding was flawed, but it was not final. America was not born perfect. It was born argumentative. Each generation has taken the founding promise and asked, what does freedom mean now? Who is we the people now? And through war, protest, amendment, and reform, the nation has evolved. Not smoothly, and not easily, but forward. This season will trace that evolution, from expansion and civil war to industrial growth and global leadership, to the fractures, reckonings, and renewals that define us today. History isn't just names and dates, it's human decisions, human contradictions, human stories. And the story of America, like its people, is still unfinished. Join us as we continue to ask the hardest, most important question. What kind of nation are we becoming? Thank you for listening to International Narratives. I'm Johnny Young, and this was How America Began.
Thanks for tuning in to International Narratives, brought to you by Young's Multimedia. If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to follow, leave a review, and share the podcast with others who love history and global stories. Got a correction, a suggestion, or a country you'd like featured? Reach out. I'd love to hear from you. Until next time, stay curious, and remember, every nation has a story worth telling.